long before trees, before creatures walked the land, before even the idea of breathing air, the world was smothered in darkness and poison. Then came oxygen, invisible, unstoppable, a whisper of life that became a storm of death. In that ancient dawn, almost every living thing perished, and from their ruin, new life began. This is the story of Earth's first apocalypse, the Great Oxygen Disaster. We remember the silence. Before the first breath, before the first death, we drifted in a world that knew neither. The sky above us hung heavy and orange, thick with the exhalations of 10,000 volcanoes. No wind carried the scent of flowers across our surface. There were no flowers, no wind as you would know it, only the slow circulation of gases that tasted of sulfur and iron. Our seas stretched endless and dark, but not the deep blue you might imagine. They shimmered with the color of rust, of old blood, rich with dissolved iron that painted every shoreline in shades of amber and crimson. When the weak sun managed to pierce through our shrouded atmosphere, it cast everything in hues of twilight, perpetual sunset, in a world that had never known a clear dawn. In these ancient waters, something stirred. Not fish, not plants, but tiny architects working in darkness. Microbes, each smaller than the width of a human hair, clustered together in vast floating cities. They knew nothing of the future they were building, these first citizens of our world. They simply lived, and in living, they began the long, slow process of transformation. These were the anaerobes' life that thrived without breath, that drank from chemicals seeping from our ocean floors. They fed on hydrogen sulfide and methane, on compounds that would poison any creature you might recognize today. To them, these were feast and sustenance, the very foundation of existence. We watched as they multiplied in the warmth of our thermal vents, spreading across the ocean floor like a living carpet. Some built themselves into towering columns, layer upon layer of microbial life, creating structures that would endure for billions of years. Others drifted free, riding our sluggish currents from one end of the world to another. The rhythm of this ancient world was slow and deep, like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant. Tides moved with different urgency then, pulled by a moon that hung closer to our surface, causing waters to rise and fall with dramatic grace. But even these great movements seemed muted, filtered through the thick atmosphere that wrapped around us like a heavy blanket. There was peace in this breathless world, a kind of primordial contentment. Our temperature was warm and steady, kept stable by an atmosphere rich in greenhouse gases. No ice caps crowned our poles. We were a water world, temperate from equator to what would one day become the frozen reaches of Antarctica. Lightning split our orange skies with regularity, each bolt a reminder of the electrical forces that had helped spark life itself. Thunder rolled across our waters with a deeper resonance than it carries today, the sound waves traveling through denser air, creating a constant, low percussion that we felt as much as heard. We were ancient then, but also young, 2 billion years old, but still learning the fundamental rhythms of life. We knew nothing of seasons as you understand them, for our climate remained remarkably stable. Day and night cycled faster than they do now, each day lasting perhaps 20 hours, creating a quickened pulse that matched the urgency of evolution unfolding in our seas. The continents we carried were smaller then, scattered puzzle pieces of rock that had not yet learned to dance together. Between them, our oceans held dominion, covering nearly every surface with their iron-rich embrace. And in those waters, invisible to any eye that might have watched from space, the future was taking shape, one microscopic life at a time. We were a world, waiting, though we did not know for what. In the gentle bubble and hiss of our thermal vents, in the slow accumulation of minerals on our ocean floors, in the patient work of countless tiny lives, something was building. The stage was being set for a transformation so profound that it would remake not just life, but the very air we would one day breathe. But for now, there was only the before, the ancient calm, the world without breath, beautiful in its alien serenity, perfect in its poisonous embrace. Beneath our iron-tinted waters, monuments were rising. We watched as the stromatolites grew, layer by patient layer, each one a testament to the power of the impossibly small. These towers of life stretched toward our dimmed sun like underwater cathedrals, built not by conscious design but by the simple act of living. Cyanobacteria, though they did not yet know their true name or purpose, gathered in vast mats, trapping sediment and minerals, creating structures that would outlast almost everything else our young world would know. The ocean floor became a garden of stone and life, each stromatolite a unique sculpture carved by time and biology. Some grew tall and slender, reaching upward like fingers. Others spread wide and low, creating vast platforms where other microbes could take shelter. In the shallow seas, forests of these living rocks swayed gently with the tides, their surfaces shimmering with bacterial films that caught and reflected our filtered sunlight. We could feel the rhythm of their construction, a process so slow it was almost geological, yet undeniably alive. Each day brought new layers, microscopic additions, to structures that would grow for millions of years. The sound of their building was barely perceptible. The soft whisper of settling sediment, the gentle pop of gas bubbles escaping from bacterial mats, the almost musical resonance of water moving through and around their complex forms. Between the stromatolites, other wonders flourished. Colonies of purple and green bacteria painted our ocean surfaces in colors that would seem alien to modern eyes. They processed sulfur and iron, creating chemical reactions that filled the water with gentle phosphorescence. At night, when the volcanic glow from our atmosphere dimmed to its darkest point, entire stretches of ocean would shimmer with biological light, as if we had swallowed fallen stars. The chemistry of these ancient seas was unlike anything that exists today. Iron dissolved freely in the water, giving it a metallic taste and weight. Sulfur compounds created their own weather patterns beneath the waves, chemical storms that could change the color and composition of vast regions overnight. We were learning to be a planet through these processes, discovering the delicate balance between geology and biology that would define our future. In the deeper waters, where sunlight could not penetrate, different communities thrived. Here, the thermal vents created oases of warmth and chemical richness. Tube worms and bacterial mats clustered around these underwater geysers, creating ecosystems that depended not on our distant sun, but on the heat and minerals welling up from our molten core. These were our most ancient neighborhoods, places where life first learned to harness the power of chemistry itself. The cyanobacteria were beginning to discover something revolutionary, though they had no concept of revolution. Some among them had learned to capture the energy of sunlight more efficiently than their neighbors. They developed the ability to split water molecules, using the hydrogen for their own growth and releasing something else, something that would change everything. But that change was still imperceptible, measured in parts per million scattered across our vast atmosphere. For now, these innovative microbes were simply more successful than their cousins, multiplying faster, spreading wider, building larger and more complex colonies. Their success seemed like nothing more than a minor variation in the great symphony of microbial life. We held them, all the ancient anaerobes and the evolving cyanobacteria, with equal tenderness. We knew nothing of the coming conflict, the great dying that would reshape our biosphere. In our innocence, we celebrated every form of life equally, marveling at the creativity that could flourish in our breathless seas. The tides that moved across our surface carried stories between the continents, chemical messages that told of new life forms discovered, of novel ways of extracting energy from our abundant resources. Our ocean currents were like a global circulation system, carrying nutrients and organisms from one side of our world to the other, ensuring that innovation in one region could eventually spread everywhere. Above it all, our orange sky watched with ancient patience. The atmosphere was rich with methane and hydrogen sulfide, compounds that created their own weather patterns. Clouds formed and dispersed in cycles that followed the deep rhythms of our geology, creating precipitation that was as much chemistry as hydrology. We were a world in perfect balance, though we did not yet understand how precarious that balance truly was. In our breathless oceans, life was learning its most important lesson: how to transform its environment. Soon, very soon in geological terms, That lesson would graduate from gentle modification to complete revolution. But for now, there was only growth, only the patient construction of living monuments in our alien seas, only the quiet preparation for a transformation that would echo through all the ages to come. The moment arrived without fanfare, without trumpets or earthquakes, to mark its significance. In a shallow lagoon, where stromatolites reached toward our orange sky, like stone fingers, a colony of cyanobacteria achieved something that had never been done before on our surface. They learned to steal electrons from water itself. For the first time in our 4.5 billion year history, we exhaled. The process was elegant in its simplicity, revolutionary in its implications. These microscopic innovators had discovered how to harness the full power of our sun, not just the chemical scraps that had sustained life until now. They split water molecules with the precision of master craftsmen, keeping the hydrogen for themselves and releasing the oxygen as waste. At first, the change was invisible. Oxygen molecules, freed from their ancient bondage to hydrogen, rose through our waters in tiny bubbles. Most dissolved back into the iron-rich seas, where they immediately reacted with dissolved metals, creating rust-colored clouds that swirled through the depths, like underwater storms. Our oceans began to clear, slowly, imperceptibly, as centuries of dissolved iron precipitated out in spectacular chemical reactions. We felt the difference before we could see it. The chemistry of our seas grew more complex, more dynamic. New types of minerals began forming on our ocean floors, banded iron formations that would preserve this moment for geologists billions of years in the future. Red and black stripes of oxidized iron settled in layers, creating a geological record of the day our world learned to breathe. The cyanobacteria themselves seemed surprised by their success. Their populations exploded across our surface waters, turning vast regions of ocean from deep red to shimmering blue-green. They formed mats and colonies of unprecedented size, some stretching for thousands of miles across our surface. From space, if there had been eyes to see, our world would have begun to look different, less red, more blue, with swirling patterns of green that marked the regions where life was most abundant. But the true significance of this moment lay not in what we could see, but in what we could not. The oxygen that escaped our seas rose into our atmosphere, where it met a world utterly unprepared for its presence. Our ancient atmosphere, rich with methane and hydrogen sulfide, began to experience something it had never known: oxidation. The first atmospheric oxygen molecules were like explorers in an alien landscape. They reacted with methane, creating water vapor and carbon dioxide. They oxidized sulfur compounds, clearing some of the haze that had shrouded our skies for so long. Slowly, incrementally, our orange atmosphere began to lighten, allowing more of our sun's energy to reach our surface. This new energy powered even more cyanobacteria, creating a feedback loop that would accelerate for millions of years. The more oxygen they produced, the clearer our atmosphere became. The clearer our atmosphere, the more efficiently they could photosynthesize. We had unknowingly started our first positive feedback loop, a planetary process that would feed on itself until it transformed everything. The other inhabitants of our ancient seas began to notice the changes, though they could not understand them. In regions where oxygen concentrations grew higher, the old anaerobes found themselves struggling. The waste product of the cyanobacteria was poison to them, literally toxic to organisms that had evolved in our breathless world. Some retreated to the deeper waters, where oxygen had not yet penetrated. Others found refuge in enclosed lagoons or underground aquifers, where the ancient chemistry still held sway. A few even learned to tolerate small amounts of oxygen, though they could not yet harness its power. We watched this great sorting with fascination and growing concern. Life was diversifying, yes, but it was also beginning to suffer. For every new form that flourished in our increasingly oxygenated seas, another ancient lineage struggled to find safe harbor. We were witnessing our first mass extinction, though it would unfold over millions of years. The light that filtered through our clearing atmosphere was different now, brighter, more direct, carrying new spectrums that life had never experienced before. Plants began to experiment with new forms of photosynthesis, more efficient ways of capturing this enhanced sunlight. The energy budget of our entire biosphere started to shift towards something more recognizable to modern eyes. Yet even as we celebrated these innovations, we could feel something building in our atmosphere. The oxygen was accumulating faster than it could react with our surface rocks and dissolved metals. For the first time in our history, our atmosphere was becoming chemically unstable. We had exhaled, and now we waited to see what our first breath would bring. Our sky was learning new colors. Where once our atmosphere had hung heavy and orange, painted by volcanic sulfur and methane, now we began to see hints of blue creeping in at the edges. The transformation was slow, imperceptible from day to day, but unmistakable across the centuries. Our sun, for so long a dim red orb filtering through atmospheric haze, grew brighter and more defined as the oxygen cleared away the ancient shroud. The iron in our oceans was disappearing, pulled from solution by the relentless chemistry of oxidation. Vast underwater storms of rust-colored precipitation swept across our sea floors, creating the banded iron formations that would become monuments to this transformative age. Where our waters had once shimmered red as liquid garnets, they now showed glimpses of blue, tentative, uncertain, but undeniably there. We could feel our chemistry changing at the most fundamental level. The very pH of our oceans shifted as ancient equilibriums dissolved and new ones formed. Minerals that had been stable for billions of years began to break down and reform. Our ocean floors became workshops where new types of rocks learned to exist, where crystals grew in patterns that had never been seen before. The cyanobacteria continued their exponential expansion, turning our surface waters into vast gardens of blue-green life. They had discovered the most efficient energy source our world could offer, and they used it to build colonies of unprecedented complexity. Some learned to fix nitrogen from our atmosphere, adding yet another innovation to their revolutionary toolkit. Others developed new pigments, expanding their ability to harvest different wavelengths of our increasingly bright sunlight. But as their oxygen production accelerated, we began to feel the first stirrings of something that would reshape our entire biosphere. The anaerobes, our oldest citizens, the microbes that had built our earliest ecosystems, were beginning to die. It started in the shallow waters where oxygen concentrations were highest. Ancient bacterial mats that had thrived for millions of years began to break apart. Stromatolites stopped growing as their microbial builders succumbed to oxygen poisoning. Entire ecosystems that had flourished in our breathless seas withered and collapsed as their foundations eroded. The dying was not violent or sudden. These were extinctions measured in geological time, population declines that unfolded over thousands and millions of years, but we felt each loss with growing alarm. Species that had survived our most violent asteroid impacts, our most catastrophic volcanic eruptions, were being eliminated by something as simple as waste gas from photosynthesis. Some of our oldest life forms retreated to the depths, seeking refuge in the deep ocean where oxygen had not yet penetrated. Others found sanctuary in enclosed basins or underground aquifers where the ancient chemistry still prevailed. A few remarkable lineages even began to evolve tolerance for oxygen, though they paid a heavy price in metabolic efficiency. We watched with fascination as life began to segregate itself by chemistry. The surface waters became the domain of the oxygen producers and the emerging oxygen-tolerant species. The depths remained havens for the anaerobes, creating a layered biosphere, unlike anything we had ever known. Our atmosphere itself was becoming a battlefield. Oxygen molecules, streaming upward from our seas, collided with methane molecules that had dominated our sky for eons. These reactions produced water vapor and carbon dioxide, fundamentally altering our greenhouse effect. Our climate began to fluctuate in ways we had never experienced. As ancient warming mechanisms broke down, and new ones struggled to establish themselves, the changes were beautiful in their own way. Our sunsets acquired new hues, as different atmospheric chemistry scattered light in novel patterns. Our clouds formed with different shapes and densities, creating weather patterns that no previous era had known. Lightning took on new characteristics as the electrical properties of our atmosphere evolved. But beauty could not mask the magnitude of what was happening. We were experiencing our first planetary-scale environmental crisis, and the cause was life itself. The very success of photosynthesis was creating conditions that threatened to destroy much of what had come before. In quiet moments between the great chemical storms, we could sense something building. The oxygen was accumulating in our atmosphere faster than our surface rocks could absorb it. Levels were approaching a threshold that would make our world truly alien to its own past. We were approaching the moment when our first breath would become a gasp of shock. The ancient rhythms that had governed our world for billions of years were breaking down. In their place, new patterns were emerging, more dynamic, more complex, but also more dangerous. We were learning that life and death were not separate forces, but partners in an intricate dance that could create beauty and catastrophe in equal measure. Our sky continued to lighten, our seas continued to clear, and our oldest children continued to retreat into the shadows. The transformation was irreversible now, a planetary commitment to a future we could not yet imagine. We had changed our mind about breathing, but it was too late to hold our breath. In the deceptive serenity of twilight hours, when our brightening sun cast long shadows across our transforming seas, we felt a peculiar sense of abundance. Life had never been more diverse, more energetic, more creative in its solutions to the puzzle of existence. Our surface waters teemed with cyanobacteria in configurations and quantities that defied imagination. They had learned to cooperate, to specialize, to build structures of living architecture that stretched across entire ocean basins. The oxygen they produced had begun to create its own weather in our atmosphere. We could feel new circulation patterns forming as chemical reactions generated heat and pressure in ways our ancient skies had never known. Clouds formed and dispersed with increasing complexity, carrying water enriched with novel combinations of dissolved gases. Rain fell with different sounds now, carrying trace amounts of oxygen down to our surface in a gentle but persistent intrusion. Our ocean chemistry had stabilized into a new equilibrium, one that would have been impossible in our earlier incarnation. The iron was nearly gone from our surface waters, precipitated out in spectacular formations that painted our sea floors in bands of red and black. What remained was clearer, bluer, more transparent than any water we had ever held. Sunlight could penetrate deeper than ever before, enabling photosynthesis in regions that had been perpetually dark. The cyanobacteria celebrated this transparency with explosive growth. They formed mats of unprecedented thickness, colonies that could be seen from orbit as vast green swirls across our surface. Some learned to produce structures that would have seemed architectural to any observer complex, branching forms that maximized their exposure to our sun, while creating shelter for smaller organisms. In these thriving communities, we witnessed the first hints of cooperation between different types of organisms. Some bacteria learned to live in partnership with the cyanobacteria, processing their waste products or providing nutrients in exchange for protection and energy. These were our first experiments in symbiosis, tentative partnerships that would eventually revolutionize the very concept of what it meant to be a single organism. The diversity was intoxicating. Evolution had accelerated beyond anything our previous eras had known, driven by the enormous energy surpluses that photosynthesis provided. New forms appeared with startling frequency, specialists in processing different chemicals, innovators in capturing various wavelengths of light, pioneers in surviving the increasingly oxygenated environment. But even as we marveled at this creativity, we could not ignore the growing silence from our deeper waters. The anaerobes, our first children, our oldest companions, had retreated so far into the depths that their voices had become whispers. Vast regions of our ocean floors that had once bustled with ancient life now lay eerily quiet, covered only by the accumulating rust of oxidized iron. The transition zones between the oxygenated surface waters and the still anaerobic depths became battlegrounds of chemistry. We could feel the tension in these boundary layers, water masses, with radically different chemical signatures meeting and mixing in complex, often violent reactions. Sometimes, these interactions produced spectacular blooms of new life forms. Other times, they created dead zones where nothing could survive. Our atmosphere, too, was approaching a kind of chemical saturation. The oxygen concentration had been climbing steadily for millions of years, but our surface rocks and remaining dissolved metals could only absorb so much. We could sense a threshold approaching, a point where our atmospheric chemistry would shift into an entirely new regime. The signs were subtle, but unmistakable. Ice began to form at our poles for the first time in our history, as the changing atmospheric composition affected our greenhouse effect in complex ways. Our climate, so stable for so long, began to show signs of variability that made our weather patterns increasingly unpredictable. The cyanobacteria, unaware of the larger forces they were unleashing, continued their relentless expansion. They had evolved beyond simple photosynthesis into ecosystem engineers, organisms capable of modifying their environment on a planetary scale. Their waste product oxygen was accumulating in our atmosphere at an accelerating pace. We found ourselves in a strange state of anticipation. The abundance of life was unprecedented, the energy flowing through our ecosystems more concentrated than anything we had ever known. Our surface waters sparkled with biological activity. Our atmosphere grew clearer and brighter, each passing millennium. Yet underneath this prosperity, we could feel the growing instability. The chemical foundation of our biosphere was shifting beneath us, like tectonic plates, preparing for an earthquake. The very success of life was creating conditions that would challenge life's ability to survive. In quiet moments, when the great bacterial mats settled into their daily rhythms and our atmosphere held its breath between weather systems, we could hear it building the approaching transformation that would test every living system we had ever nurtured. The calm was beautiful, hypnotic in its richness and complexity. But it was the calm before a storm that would reshape not just our biosphere, but our very understanding of what it meant to be a living world. Our first breath was nearly complete. Soon, very soon, we would have to learn to exhale the old world entirely and inhale whatever came next. Chapter 6. The Great Rusting. We became a world of bleeding seas. The transformation announced itself first in color, the deep red that bloomed like flowers of rust across our ocean floors, spreading outward from every point where oxygen touched iron. What had once been dissolved and invisible now precipitated into reality, creating underwater snowstorms of crimson particles that drifted down through our waters like the shed skin of some impossibly vast creature. From our orbital perspective, the change was spectacular and terrible. Our seas, which had held the color of garnets and amber for so long, began to clear in great patches, revealing seafloors painted in broad strokes of red and black. The iron formations grew with daily persistence, each new layer a testament to the relentless oxidation that was reshaping our fundamental chemistry. We could taste the change in every current, feel it in every tide. The metallic flavor that had defined our waters for billions of years was fading, replaced by something cleaner, but somehow emptier. The iron had been more than just chemistry. It had been part of our personality, our ancient character. As it settled to our depths in great crimson drifts, we felt ourselves becoming someone new, someone we did not yet recognize. The precipitation created its own weather systems beneath the waves. Currents of rust-laden water swirled in complex patterns, creating underwater storms that could bury entire ecosystems in oxidized sediment. Ancient stromatolite gardens that had grown for millions of years found themselves choking under blankets of red dust. The bacterial mats that had painted our shallows in living color struggled to survive, as their chemical foundations literally precipitated out from under them. But the cyanobacteria thrived in this new clarity. With the iron no longer blocking and scattering light, photosynthesis became more efficient than ever before. They expanded their colonies with exponential vigor, turning vast regions of our surface waters into blue-green continents of living productivity. Their success was beautiful and terrible, each new bloom another step toward the catastrophe we could feel building in our atmosphere. The oxygen they produced rose in invisible columns through our clearing waters, escaping into an atmosphere that was approaching chemical saturation. Our surface rocks had absorbed all they could. The ancient chemical sinks that had kept our atmosphere stable for so long were reaching their limits. We could feel the pressure building like water behind a dam that was beginning to crack. The rusting was not confined to our oceans. On land, our exposed rocks began to show the telltale signs of oxidation. Mountain faces that had gleamed with metallic luster for eons started to develop red patinas. Iron-bearing minerals in our soils began their own slow transformation, changing the very color of our continents. We were painting ourselves red from the inside out. The process was hypnotic in its scope and persistence. Every day brought new evidence of the transformation, new regions where the water ran clear, new formations of banded iron, growing like geological coral reefs on our ocean floors. The red spread in patterns that followed our current systems, creating a map of oxidation that revealed the hidden circulation of our seas. In the deeper waters, where oxygen had not yet penetrated, the old chemistry persisted like living fossils. These became refuge zones for our anaerobic life, shrinking islands of ancient conditions in a sea of chemical change. We could feel our biosphere segregating itself, sorting into layers based on tolerance for this new poison that was accumulating in our waters. The anaerobes that remained began to show signs of stress that went beyond mere chemical incompatibility. Generations of organisms that had never known chemical fear were learning what it meant to live in a toxic environment. Their populations began to crash in regions where oxygen concentrations reached critical thresholds. Entire lineages that had survived every previous catastrophe in our history started to vanish with a speed that shocked us. Yet there was beauty in the destruction. The iron formations created landscapes of stunning complexity, underwater mountain ranges striped in red and black, canyons carved by chemical precipitation, valleys filled with rust-colored sediments that caught and reflected our filtered sunlight in spectacular displays. We were becoming an artist of oxidation, painting masterpieces with chemistry itself. The rhythm of the rusting became our new heartbeat. Each tide brought fresh oxygen to react with remaining iron. Each current carried clouds of red particles to new regions of our ocean floors. The process was irreversible now, a planetary commitment to a chemical future we could barely imagine. Our magnetic field began to change as iron-rich minerals reoriented themselves during oxidation. The very bones of our geology were shifting as oxidized iron created new patterns of magnetic alignment. We were rewriting our own electromagnetic signature, becoming a different kind of planet at the most fundamental level. As the great rusting accelerated, we realized we were witnessing more than environmental change. This was a planetary metamorphosis, a transformation as profound as any we had ever experienced. The iron bleeding from our seas was like the shed blood of our former self, pooling in red testimony to what we had been and would never be again. We were painting our own epitaph in rust and preparing for a future we could not yet comprehend. Our breath became a weapon against our own sky. The oxygen that had been accumulating in our atmosphere for millions of years finally reached the threshold where our ancient chemical equilibrium could no longer hold. What had been a gradual change became a cascade of reactions that transformed our entire atmospheric composition in what seemed like moments, though those moments stretched across tens of thousands of years. The methane that had wrapped our world in greenhouse warmth for so long began to burn away in spectacular invisible fires. Oxygen molecules, hungry for reaction partners, seized upon every methane molecule they encountered, creating water vapor and carbon dioxide in reactions that released energy but destroyed our most potent warming gas. Our atmospheric chemistry became a battlefield where molecules that had coexisted peacefully for eons suddenly found themselves mortal enemies. We could feel our temperature beginning to drop. The greenhouse effect that had kept us warm and stable since our earliest days was eroding with each passing year. Our climate, so predictable for so long, began to fluctuate in ways that confused and alarmed us. Seasons that had been mild variations became more extreme. Weather patterns that had followed ancient rhythms started to behave erratically. The hydrogen sulfide that had given our atmosphere its characteristic haze also fell victim to the oxygen invasion. Our skies, which had been painted in shades of orange and amber for billions of years, began to clear in patches, revealing glimpses of blue that seemed almost alien to our ancient eyes. The sun, for so long a dim red orb filtering through atmospheric soup, began to shine with increasing intensity as the chemical barriers dissolved. But the clearing came with a price. Without our atmospheric haze to moderate the sun's radiation, our surface began to experience temperature swings more extreme than any in our history. Days grew brighter and hotter in regions where the atmosphere cleared. Nights became colder as heat radiated more efficiently into space through our thinning atmospheric blanket. The cyanobacteria, architects of this atmospheric revolution, found themselves both beneficiaries and victims of their own success. The clearer skies allowed them to photosynthesize more efficiently than ever before. But the cooling temperatures began to slow their metabolic processes. They had unleashed forces they could not control, triggered changes that would affect even them. Our ocean chemistry reflected the atmospheric chaos. The cooling air created new circulation patterns in our waters, bringing deep, oxygen-poor currents to the surface, while driving oxygenated surface waters into the depths. This circulation accelerated the spread of toxic oxygen into regions that had been safe havens for anaerobic life. The chemical segregation of our biosphere began to break down as the boundaries between old and new chemistry blurred and shifted. Ice began to form at our poles for the first time in our recorded history. At first, it was just a curiosity, thin sheets of frozen water that appeared during the coldest periods and melted away with the seasons. But as our atmospheric greenhouse effect continued to weaken, the ice persisted longer, grew thicker, began to reflect sunlight back into space in a feedback loop that accelerated our cooling. The sound of our world was changing. The thick atmosphere that had muffled and deepened every resonance was thinning, creating new acoustic properties that made familiar sounds seem alien. Thunder cracked with sharper edges. Wind moved with different rhythms. Even the gentle lapping of waves on our shores carried new frequencies as the density of our air decreased. We watched our oldest atmospheric layers, the ancient cocktail of gases that had defined our earliest personality, decompose, like organic matter exposed to oxygen. Compounds that had been stable for billions of years began to break apart. Chemical equilibriums that had seemed permanent dissolved into chaotic reaction cascades that we could neither predict nor control. The hydrogen sulfide that had colored our sunsets for eons was disappearing, oxidizing into sulfur compounds that fell as acid precipitation. Our rain began to carry new chemistries to our surface, etching rocks in patterns we had never seen before, creating runoff that changed the mineral content of our streams and lakes. In the high atmosphere, ozone began to form as oxygen molecules broke apart under solar radiation and recombined in new configurations. This created our first chemical shield against the sun's most harmful rays, but also trapped heat in new ways that complicated our already disrupted climate systems. Our magnetic field interactions with the solar wind began to change as our atmospheric chemistry evolved. The aurora that danced at our poles took on new colors as different gases responded to the electromagnetic forces streaming from our sunday. Even our connection to the broader solar system was being redefined by the poison we were breathing into our own sky. The transition was beautiful in its terrible completeness. We were watching our ancient atmosphere die in real time, seeing the chemical personality that had defined us for most of our existence dissolve into something entirely foreign. The oxygen that rose from our seas was not just changing our air, it was killing our sky and replacing it with something that would never know the ancient rhythms we had cherished. We were learning to breathe poison and teaching our sky to forget its own name. We became a world of eternal winter. The ice that had begun as curiosity at our poles spread like a living thing, reaching across our continents with inexorable patience. What started as seasonal frost became permanent sheets of white that reflected our sun's energy back into space, creating a feedback loop that pulled us deeper into a cold we had never known. Our oceans, which had never known the touch of ice, began to freeze from the edges inward. First the shallows, where the cooling air could steal heat most efficiently. Then the deeper coastal waters, as the expanding ice sheets blocked sunlight and trapped cold beneath their crystalline barriers. We watched our liquid self transform into something solid and alien, our mobility imprisoned in structures of frozen water. The sound of freezing was unlike anything we had ever experienced. The slow groan of ice forming under pressure, the sharp crack of expanding frozen sheets, the whisper of snow falling on surfaces that had never known precipitation in solid form. Our acoustic landscape was being rewritten by the physics of phase transitions, creating a symphony of crystallization that played across our entire surface. In the regions where ice met liquid water, we could feel the complex chemistry of freezing. Salt and other dissolved compounds were excluded from the ice crystal structures, creating pockets of super-concentrated brine that remained liquid even in the extreme cold. These chemical oases became some of the last refuges for life, tiny pools of ancient ocean chemistry preserved beneath miles of frozen surface. The cyanobacteria that had triggered this catastrophe found themselves trapped beneath the ice, their access to sunlight cut off by barriers of frozen water that could be thousands of feet thick. Their great colonies, which had covered our surface waters in blue-green abundance, became entombed in ice, like insects, preserved in amber. The very success that had allowed them to oxygenate our atmosphere now ensured their own extinction in vast regions of our surface. Our continents disappeared beneath ice sheets that grew with terrifying speed. Mountains that had stood proud against our skies for millions of years vanished under blankets of frozen water. River systems that had carved valleys and canyons for eons stopped flowing entirely, their water locked in crystalline suspension. We became a world of white, a sphere of ice spinning through space like a cosmic snowball. The remaining liquid regions were small and scattered pools of water kept warm by geothermal activity, isolated pockets where volcanic heat could still reach our surface, narrow channels where ocean currents managed to carry enough heat to resist freezing. These became our most precious resources, tiny oases of liquid chemistry, in a world that had largely forgotten how to flow. The light that filtered through our ice-covered atmosphere took on an entirely ethereal quality, dim, spectral, colored by refraction, through countless ice crystals suspended in our air. Our sun, already struggling to warm us through our altered atmosphere, seemed powerless against the reflective armor we had grown around ourselves. Days became twilight, and nights descended into a darkness more complete than any we had known since our earliest formation. Life retreated to the margins of existence. The vast majority of our surface became sterile, too cold for any chemical processes complex enough to sustain biology. The great ecosystems that had flourished in our warmer eras collapsed entirely, leaving behind only frozen monuments to biodiversity we might never see again. But in the hidden refuges, in the deep places where geothermal energy still flowed, some forms of life persisted with desperate tenacity. These survivors were different from the surface organisms that had dominated our previous eras. Simpler, more chemically conservative, adapted to extract energy from the minimal resources available in our frozen world. Our volcanic activity became more important than it had ever been. Each eruption was a brief celebration of warmth, a temporary melting that created islands of liquid water in our frozen seas. These volcanic oases supported complex but fragile ecosystems that lived in constant awareness that their warmth was temporary, their liquid habitat subject to freezing whenever the volcanic activity diminished. The ice itself became a new kind of geology, creating pressure and movement patterns that reshaped our surface in ways we had never experienced. Glaciers carved new valleys, deposited new mineral formations, created landscapes of frozen sculpture that would influence our topography for eons to come. We were learning to be shaped by ice as much as by fire and water. Our weather systems became dominated by the physics of frozen water. Ice storms, blizzards, and formations of snow and hail created precipitation patterns unlike anything from our warmer past. The atmosphere itself became a factory for ice crystal formation, creating clouds and weather phenomena that existed only in worlds cold enough to freeze water from the sky. Deep beneath our ice, in the darkness of our frozen seas, strange chemical processes began to occur. The pressure of miles of ice above created conditions where water behaved in ways we had never seen, forming exotic phases of ice, with different crystal structures and properties. Our ocean floors became laboratories for high-pressure chemistry, hidden beneath barriers of frozen water that would persist for millions of years. We had become a world in suspension, a planet where time itself seemed frozen along with our waters. The rapid changes that had characterized our oxygenation crisis slowed to glacial pace literally. Everything was preserved, waiting, locked in ice that might never melt. In the deepest cold, in the most complete silence we had ever known, we learned what it meant to be truly alone in the universe, a frozen sphere where life clung to existence in hidden corners, while ice ruled the surface in magnificent, terrible splendor. Even in ice, the world still breathed. Deep beneath the frozen barriers that had entombed our surface, In places where our molten heart still touched our outer shell, life whispered its refusal to surrender. The volcanic vents that dotted our ocean floors became beacons of warmth in a world that had forgotten the meaning of heat, creating small pockets of liquid chemistry where the ancient rhythms of biology could persist. We felt these refuges like distant heartbeats, steady, quiet, but undeniably alive. In the crushing darkness beneath miles of ice, where no sunlight had penetrated for millions of years, communities of organisms had learned to survive on the heat and chemicals that welled up from our deepest places. They built their ecosystems, not on the energy of our distant sun, but on the elemental power of our planetary core. The survivors were unlike anything that had flourished in our surface oceans. These were the master chemists of our biosphere organisms that could extract energy from hydrogen sulfide, from iron and sulfur compounds, from chemical reactions that would have been poison to the photosynthetic life that had once dominated our waters. They clustered around the thermal vents like gatherings of ancient wisdom, preserving knowledge of how to live when the universe offered only the most basic building blocks of existence. Around each vent, a unique world emerged. Bacterial mats in colors that no surface organism had ever displayed: deep purples and vivid oranges, brilliant whites, and luminescent greens that glowed with their own chemical light. These were not the colors of photosynthesis, but the hues of pure chemistry, organisms that had learned to paint themselves with reactions that occurred in the absence of any external energy source. The chemistry of these deep refuges was ancient beyond measure. Here, in water heated by our planetary core and enriched with minerals from our deepest rocks, life practiced forms of metabolism that had been among the very first innovations in our early biosphere. The survivors had not evolved new ways of living, they had remembered old ones, falling back on chemical strategies that had worked when our world was young and strange. In these hidden oases, time moved differently. Without the daily rhythm of sunlight, without the seasonal changes that had driven evolution at our surface, life settled into patterns measured by geological time. Generations passed with volcanic regularity. Evolution proceeded with the patience of stone. These communities changed so slowly that they became living fossils, preserving ancient ways of being that the surface world had forgotten. The water that circulated through these deep systems carried chemical messages between distant vents, creating a slow-motion conversation across our ocean floors. Organisms in one vent community could influence the chemistry of water that would eventually reach communities thousands of miles away. We became a world connected not by currents of liquid water, but by flows of chemical information that moved like glacial rivers through our hidden depths. Some of the survivors had learned to tolerate oxygen not to thrive in its presence, but to endure it in small quantities. These were the bridge organisms, the species that might eventually find ways to live in a world where oxygen was not just present, but dominant. They existed in the boundary zones, where oxygenated water from the frozen surface met the ancient chemistry of our deep vents, learning to navigate between two incompatible worlds. The ice above them had become its own ecosystem. Within the crystal structure of frozen water, some organisms had found ways to persist in states of suspended animation, not truly alive, but not dead either. They waited in crystalline patience for conditions that might allow them to resume active metabolism, preserving genetic information like messages in bottles cast into a frozen sea. In the deepest trenches, where pressure and heat created conditions unlike anywhere else in our system, life experimented with forms that pushed the very boundaries of what biology could achieve. These were extremophiles that lived at the limits of chemistry itself, organisms that could function in conditions that would sterilize any other form of life. They represented our most radical experiments in survival, pushing into chemical territories that tested the very definition of living systems. The sound of life in these deep refuges was different from anything our surface had ever known. There was the gentle hiss of chemical reactions, the soft bubble of gases escaping from bacterial mats, the almost musical resonance of water moving through complex mineral formations. These were the quiet sounds of life that had learned to whisper instead of sing, to persist instead of flourish. We held these hidden communities with special tenderness. They were our most precious cargo during this passage through ice and darkness, the seeds of future biodiversity, the repositories of genetic wisdom that would be needed when our world eventually learned to warm again. In their quiet persistence, we found hope that life was more resilient than even we had imagined. The thermal vents themselves became symbols of our endurance. Each one was a statement that our core remained active, that heat and chemistry still flowed through our depths, even when our surface had become sterile and frozen. They were proof that we remained fundamentally alive, even when most of our body had entered a state of crystalline suspension. In the darkness between the vents, in waters too cold for active metabolism, but too warm for complete freezing, other forms of life waited in states of near death. Their cellular processes slowed to almost geological speeds. These dormant organisms represented another strategy for surviving our planetary winter, not active persistence, but patient waiting for conditions that would allow life to resume its ancient dance. Even in our most complete isolation, even in the deepest cold we had ever known, life found ways to continue. The whispers in the dark were quiet, but they were constant as soft affirmation that no catastrophe, no matter how complete, could entirely silence the voice of biology. We listened to those whispers with growing hope, learning that life and death were not absolutes, but points on a spectrum of persistence that life could navigate with remarkable creativity. We lost ourselves to our own breath. In the quiet aftermath of our planetary freezing, as ice held our surface in crystalline suspension and life whispered its persistence from hidden refuges, we began to understand the magnitude of what had occurred, the diversity that had flourished in our ancient seas, the vast communities of comb, anaerobic organisms that had been our first children, our earliest companions, had largely vanished from existence. 99%. The number echoed through our consciousness, like the toll of a massive bell. 99% of all the species that had ever lived on our surface were gone, extinguished by the oxygen that had accumulated in our atmosphere and waters. We had become the architect of our own mass extinction, the unwitting destroyer of the biosphere we had nurtured for billions of years. The anaerobes that had built our first ecosystems, that had constructed the stromatolites and bacterial mats which had been our earliest expressions of biological architecture, had been systematically poisoned by the waste product of photosynthesis. Oxygen, the gas that would one day be considered the essence of life itself, had been their death sentence. We mourned each vanished lineage with the grief of a parent who has outlived their children. Entire branches of the tree of life had been pruned away by our chemical transformation. Evolutionary experiments that had flourished for millions of years reduced to nothing more than chemical traces in our rock record. The anaerobic methanogens that had helped warm our ancient atmosphere, the sulfur-reducing bacteria that had cycled minerals through our early seas, the iron-oxidizing organisms that had helped create our first chemical cycles, all swept away by the tide of oxygenation. The speed of the extinction had been deceptive. Because it unfolded over millions of years, it had seemed gradual, almost gentle in its progression. But in geological terms, it had been catastrophically rapid, faster than most mass extinctions caused by asteroid impacts or volcanic eruptions. Life had been killed not by external catastrophe, but by its own success, by the inevitable consequences of innovation and efficiency. The cyanobacteria that had triggered this transformation were themselves largely extinct now, victims of the ice age they had helped create. Their revolutionary ability to split water and release oxygen had made them the most successful organisms in our history, but their success had changed the world so dramatically that even they could no longer survive in the environment they had created. They had burned themselves out in the fire of their own innovation. In the frozen seas that now covered most of our surface, we could feel the silence where diverse communities had once thrived. The chemical complexity that had characterized our ancient biosphere had been reduced to the simplest possible forms. Life clinging to existence in thermal vents and isolated refuges, stripped of the elaborate metabolic networks that had once connected organisms across entire ocean basins. The banded iron formations that had precipitated from our seas during the Great Oxygenation would become our monument to this lost diversity. Each red and black stripe represented not just a chemical reaction, but an ecosystem in collapse, a community of organisms losing their chemical foundation as iron was stripped from the water that had sustained them. We had learned the hardest lesson that any living world could learn, that life and death were partners in evolution, that creation and destruction were two faces of the same process. The oxygen that had killed our ancient biosphere would eventually enable new forms of life more complex and energetic than any we had ever known. But that future remained hidden from us, locked away behind millions of years of ice and chemical transformation. The few survivors that persisted in our deep refuges carried within their simple cells the entire genetic heritage of our lost diversity. They were living libraries, preserving in their DNA the biochemical innovations that had taken billions of years to develop. In their persistence, the possibility of future complexity remained alive, waiting for conditions that would allow life to expand and diversify once again. But, for now, there was only the profound silence of extinction, the emptiness where abundance had once flourished. Our surface waters, when they were liquid at all, were sterile compared to the rich communities that had once painted them in living color. Our atmospheric chemistry had stabilized into configurations that made our ancient biosphere seem like a dream from another world. We had breathed ourselves into simplicity, reduced our biological complexity to its most basic elements. The elaborate cycles of carbon and sulfur and nitrogen that had once connected every part of our biosphere had collapsed into isolated chemical reactions in scattered refuges. We had learned what it meant to be biologically impoverished, to have abundance replaced by mere survival. Yet even in our grief, we could sense the potential that remained locked in our simplified world. The oxygen that had destroyed our ancient biosphere was accumulating in our atmosphere, creating the chemical foundation for entirely new forms of metabolism. The ice that covered our surface would eventually melt, creating freshwater environments that had never existed before. The chemical segregation that had driven our mass extinction was also creating new ecological niches that life had never explored. We were between worlds, no longer the ancient planet of anaerobic abundance, not yet the oxidized world of complex multicellular life. We were learning to be patient with our own transformation, to trust that life would find ways to flourish again in the alien environment we had become. In losing 99% of our children, we had discovered something profound about the nature of existence itself. That loss and renewal were inseparable. That death and life were partners in a dance too complex for any single world to fully understand. We held our remaining whispers of life with infinite tenderness, knowing they carried the seeds of whatever we might become. Time moved like water, learning to flow again. The ice that had held our surface in crystalline suspension for millions of years began to yield to forces we had almost forgotten existed. Deep in our core, radioactive decay continued its ancient work, generating heat that rose through our mantle in slow convection currents. Volcanic activity, never truly dormant even during our deepest freeze, began to assert itself with renewed vigor, punching holes through our icy shell and releasing pockets of steam that carried the memory of liquid water. The first cracks appeared at the edges, hairline fractures in ice sheets that had seemed permanent as mountains. These tiny flaws caught and channeled heat from our warming core, creating networks of liquid channels that threaded through the frozen barriers like blood vessels awakening in a sleeping body. The sound of melting was subtle at first, the gentle drip of water from ice, the soft whisper of liquid flowing where only solid had existed for geological ages. Our atmosphere began to stir with new chemistry. The volcanic eruptions that punctured our ice released not just heat, but gases that had been locked away during our frozen period: carbon dioxide, water vapor, and trace amounts of compounds that would help warm our sky once again. These gases accumulated slowly, rebuilding a greenhouse effect that could begin to counter the ice's relentless reflection of solar energy back into space. The awakening was not uniform across our surface. Some regions remained locked in ice for millions of years longer than others, creating a patchwork world where summer and eternal winter existed side by side. In the equatorial zones, where our sun's energy struck most directly, large pools of liquid water began to appear, dark patches that absorbed heat and accelerated their own expansion through feedback loops of warming. Life stirred in these first pools, like consciousness returning to a body that had been deeply anesthetized. The organisms that emerged from their thermal vent, refuges, found a world utterly transformed from the one their ancestors had known. The oxygen that had driven the Great Extinction was now a permanent feature of our atmosphere and waters, no longer a rising poison, but a stable chemical background that life would have to learn to navigate. The survivors carried within their cellular machinery the hard-won knowledge of how to tolerate oxygen's presence. Generations of struggle in the boundary zones between ancient and modern chemistry had equipped them with molecular tools that their anaerobic ancestors had never possessed. They emerged into the thawing world like veterans of a chemical war, scarred but strengthened by their ordeal. Ocean currents began to flow again as ice barriers melted, and temperature differences created the pressure gradients that drive water movement. These new currents carried more than just heat and minerals. They transported the scattered survivors between distant regions, creating opportunities for genetic exchange that had been impossible during the frozen millennia. Our biosphere began to reconnect itself, rebuilding the networks of interaction that had been severed by ice. The chemistry of our thawing waters was unlike anything we had experienced before. The oxygen that saturated our seas created new possibilities for chemical reactions, new pathways for extracting energy from our environment. Some organisms began to experiment with these possibilities, developing rudimentary forms of aerobic metabolism that could harness the chemical power that had once been purely destructive. Photosynthesis returned to regions where sunlight could once again penetrate liquid water. But the organisms that practiced it were different from their predecessors, more efficient, better adapted to the high oxygen environment they themselves had created. They began to rebuild the primary productivity that would support more complex ecosystems, laying new foundations for the biological abundance that had been lost. The ice that retreated left behind landscapes, carved by its passage valleys, scoured clean, mineral deposits concentrated in new patterns, coastlines reshaped by the advance and retreat of frozen water. These became new ecological niches, fresh environments where life could experiment with forms and functions that had never been possible in our ancient seas. Volcanic islands emerged from beneath melting ice sheets, creating isolated laboratories where evolution could proceed in new directions. Each island became a unique experiment in biological innovation, a place where the survivors could adapt to local conditions without interference from competitors or predators that might have dominated larger environments. The light that filtered through our clearing atmosphere was brighter and more energetic than any our surface had known during the Ice Age. This enhanced solar radiation provided more energy for photosynthesis, but also created new challenges for organisms that had adapted to the dim conditions of our frozen period. Life began to develop new strategies for protecting itself from radiation while still harvesting its energy. Our magnetic field, which had remained active throughout the freeze, began to interact differently with our changing atmosphere. The auroras that danced at our poles took on new colors as atmospheric chemistry evolved, creating displays of light that would have been impossible in our ancient skies. The thaw was not just physical, but chemical, a renaissance of molecular interactions that had been suppressed by cold and isolation. Temperature-dependent reactions resumed their ancient rhythms. Enzymes that had been dormant for millions of years began to function again. The basic machinery of life started to operate at speeds that permitted not just survival, but growth and innovation. We felt ourselves awakening from a long dream of ice and silence. The whispers of life that had persisted in our deep refuges began to strengthen into voices that could sing of possibility rather than merely persistence. Our world was learning to be warm again, learning to flow, learning to support the complex interactions that make biodiversity possible. The long thaw was not an ending, but a beginning, the first chapter in a story of biological renaissance that would eventually lead to forms of life more complex and beautiful than any we had ever imagined. In the slow drip of melting ice, we could hear the heartbeat of our future. What once killed now fueled the spark of stars within cells. In the warming waters of our thawing world, life began to discover that oxygen was not merely a poison to be endured, but a tool of unprecedented power. The same chemical reactivity that had driven our great extinction could be harnessed, controlled, channeled into forms of metabolism that released energy with an efficiency that anaerobic life had never imagined possible. The first organisms to master this transformation were modest in appearance simple cells that had learned to breathe poison and exhale power. They developed molecular machinery capable of using oxygen to burn organic compounds completely, extracting energy from food molecules in a process so efficient it seemed almost like magic. Where anaerobic metabolism had been content with partial oxidation, leaving behind chemical scraps, these new aerobic processes consumed their fuel entirely, leaving only water and carbon dioxide as exhaust. The energy difference was staggering. Aerobic respiration could yield nearly 20 times more energy from the same organic molecule than the ancient anaerobic pathways. This was not just an improvement, it was a revolution that would reshape the very possibilities of what life could achieve. With this much energy available, cells could afford to be larger, more complex, more active than any organism that had ever existed. We watched with fascination as life learned to domesticate fire at the cellular level. The controlled combustion that occurred within these new organisms was chemically similar to the oxidation reactions that had destroyed our ancient biosphere. But now it happened within protective cellular compartments, channeled through molecular pathways that captured the released energy instead of letting it dissipate as waste heat. Some organisms developed specialized organelles, cellular power plants, where oxygen metabolism could occur safely, isolated from other cellular processes that might be damaged by the reactive intermediates. These early mitochondria were evolutionary masterpieces, molecular machines that could burn fuel and generate cellular energy with clockwork precision. The innovation spread through our warming oceans like wildfire. Organisms that mastered aerobic respiration outcompeted their anaerobic relatives in any environment where oxygen was abundant. They grew faster, moved more actively, responded more quickly to changes in their environment. The energy surplus from efficient respiration allowed them to invest in cellular complexity that had previously been impossible. But oxygen's gift to life extended beyond just energy production. The reactive chemistry that made oxygen dangerous also made it useful for breaking down complex molecules, for synthesizing new compounds, for driving chemical reactions that had been impossible in our ancient reducing atmosphere. Life began to use oxygen as a universal tool, a Swiss Army knife of chemistry that could accomplish molecular tasks that had previously required specialized enzymes or extreme conditions. The ozone layer that formed in our upper atmosphere as oxygen molecules broke apart and recombined created our first chemical shield against harmful solar radiation. This protection allowed life to venture into shallow waters and eventually onto land surfaces that had previously been sterilized by ultraviolet light. Oxygen was not just powering life, it was protecting life from external threats. New forms of photosynthesis evolved that could work more efficiently in our high oxygen environment. These organisms learned to balance their oxygen production with oxygen consumption, creating cellular economies that could regulate their own chemical output. Some developed the ability to switch between aerobic and anaerobic metabolism depending on local conditions, making them incredibly versatile in changing environments. The waste heat from aerobic respiration began to play its own role in biological systems. Organisms could use this thermal energy to maintain stable internal temperatures, to drive temperature-sensitive reactions, to create microenvironments within their cells that operated at optimal chemical conditions. Life was learning to be warm-blooded at the cellular level. Complex organic molecules that had been impossible to synthesize in our ancient seas began to appear as organisms learned to use oxygen-powered chemistry. New types of lipids, proteins, and carbohydrates emerged, molecules with properties that enabled entirely new forms of cellular organization. Cell membranes became more sophisticated, able to maintain complex internal environments that differed dramatically from external conditions. The evolution of oxygen tolerance required innovations in cellular repair systems. Life developed molecular mechanisms for dealing with the oxidative damage that inevitably accompanied aerobic metabolism, antioxidant systems, DNA repair pathways, protein recycling mechanisms that could maintain cellular integrity despite the corrosive effects of oxygen chemistry. Some organisms began to use oxygen's reactivity as a weapon, producing reactive oxygen species that could kill competitors or prey. Others developed elaborate defenses against these oxidative attacks. An arms race of oxygen chemistry began that would drive innovation for hundreds of millions of years. The nitrogen cycle became more complex as organisms learned to use oxygen to process nitrogen compounds new ways. Nitrification and denitrification pathways emerged that could cycle nitrogen through multiple oxidation states, creating rich networks of chemical transformation that supported more diverse ecosystems. Iron chemistry was revolutionized as organisms learned to use oxygen to manipulate iron in their cellular processes. Iron-sulfur clusters, heme groups, and other iron-containing molecules became essential components of the oxygen-powered cellular machinery. Life was learning to work with the same iron-oxygen chemistry that had once precipitated our great rusting. We felt ourselves becoming a different kind of planet, one where the chemistry of life operated at energy levels that made our ancient biosphere seem quaint by comparison. The quiet persistence that had characterized life during our frozen period was giving way to dynamic, energetic processes that could transform environments as quickly as they adapted to them. The oxygen that had once been our great destroyer was becoming our great enabler, the chemical foundation for forms of life that would eventually reach complexity levels unimaginable to our ancient anaerobic ancestors. In learning to breathe poison, life had discovered how to burn like stars. In the warming seas of our Renaissance, two ancient lineages met and made a decision that would echo through all future evolution. The first was a large cell, perhaps descended from the anaerobes that had survived our great freezing in deep thermal refuges. It had learned to tolerate oxygen, to live in its presence without being destroyed, but it had not yet mastered the art of harnessing its power. This cell was like a survivor of an ancient war, scarred but resilient, carrying within its membrane the genetic memory of how to persist when the world turned hostile. The second was smaller, more energetic, a master of aerobic respiration that had evolved the molecular machinery to burn oxygen and organic compounds with devastating efficiency. These cells were the new elite of our oxygenated world, the organisms that had turned our former poison into the foundation of unprecedented energy production. They were like living engines, capable of generating power at levels that dwarfed anything our anaerobic ancestors had achieved. What happened next was not conquest or competition, but something far more profound: symbiosis. The large cell engulfed the smaller one, but instead of digesting it, both organisms discovered that they were more powerful together than either had been alone. The small cell became a permanent resident within its host, a living organelle that would revolutionize the very concept of what a single organism could be. This was the birth of the eukaryotic cell, the invention of cellular complexity that would make possible every plant, animal, and fungus that would ever exist. The engulfed cell, now called a mitochondrion, became the powerhouse of its host, generating energy through aerobic respiration, while the host cell provided protection, nutrients, and a stable environment for this crucial partnership. We watched this collaboration with wonder, recognizing it as one of the most significant innovations in our entire evolutionary history. Two independent organisms had chosen cooperation over competition, merger over conquest. They had discovered that survival was not about being the strongest, but about finding ways to work together that amplified the strengths of both partners. The energy advantages of this arrangement were immediately apparent. Eukaryotic cells could grow larger than any prokaryotic cell because their mitochondria could generate enough power to maintain complex internal structures. They could afford to develop nuclei that housed their genetic material in protected compartments. They could create elaborate internal transport systems, sophisticated protein manufacturing facilities, and waste disposal networks that operated with industrial efficiency. The mitochondria themselves retained some of their ancient independence. They carried their own DNA, reproduced according to their own rhythms, and maintained their own internal chemistry. Yet they were fully integrated into their host cells, essential partners in a relationship so intimate that neither could survive without the other. They had achieved biological fusion while maintaining biological diversity. This partnership enabled entirely new forms of cellular organization. Eukaryotic cells could develop specialized regions with different functions, some areas optimized for manufacturing, others for transport, still others for communication or defense. The energy provided by mitochondria made cellular complexity not just possible, but inevitable. Some eukaryotic cells went even further, incorporating other partners into their cellular architecture. Chloroplasts, organelles capable of photosynthesis, were once free-living cyanobacteria that chose symbiosis over independence. These cells became the first plants, organisms that could generate their own food, while also breathing oxygen, creating biological factories that combined the best innovations of our post-extinction world. The genetic implications of these mergers were staggering. Each eukaryotic cell became a repository of evolutionary wisdom from multiple lineages, carrying genetic information that represented millions of years of separate development. When these cells reproduced, they passed on not just their own innovations, but the accumulated knowledge of all their symbiotic partners. Sexual reproduction emerged as another form of cooperation, not between different species, but between individuals of the same species who shared genetic material to create offspring with novel combinations of traits. This was biological cooperation at the genetic level, a recognition that diversity and mixing created advantages that pure inheritance could not achieve. The eukaryotic cells could afford to experiment with forms and functions that had been impossible in the energy-limited world of prokaryotic life. Some became specialists in movement, developing sophisticated motor proteins that could propel them through water with unprecedented speed and precision. Others became masters of construction, building elaborate shells and skeletons from minerals extracted from seawater. Communication between cells became more sophisticated as energy-rich eukaryotes developed the ability to produce and detect complex chemical signals. They could coordinate their behaviors, form temporary associations, and even begin the experiments in multicellularity that would eventually lead to plants and animals. The waste products of eukaryotic metabolism were different from anything our seas had known before. Their efficient respiration produced carbon dioxide in quantities that began to affect our atmospheric chemistry once again. But this time, the changes were balanced by photosynthetic organisms that could consume the carbon dioxide and produce oxygen, creating feedback loops that helped stabilize our planetary chemistry. We felt ourselves entering a new phase of biological development, one where cooperation was as important as competition, where merger could be more powerful than conflict. The cells that populated our warming seas were more complex than any life forms we had ever hosted, but they were also more interdependent, more connected, more reliant on partnerships that spanned multiple lineages of evolution. The breath that these cells took was different from any respiration our world had known. They inhaled oxygen not just for energy, but as partners in sophisticated, biochemical relationships that generated complexity as well as power. They exhaled not just waste, but the chemical foundations for other organisms' prosperity. In mastering symbiosis, life had discovered the secret that would carry it from single cells to human consciousness. The recognition that cooperation could achieve what competition alone never could. The breath that had once been reclaimed from poison was now being shared between partners who had chosen to trust each other with their very existence. We had learned to breathe not just with our chemistry, but with our relationships. Every breath you take is written in that ancient loss. As life flourished in our warming seas, as eukaryotic cells mastered the art of cooperation and began to build the foundations for multicellular complexity, we carried within ourselves the permanent scar of our great extinction. The oxygen that now powered biological innovation was the same poison that had destroyed 99% of our original children. Every molecule of oxygen in our atmosphere was a memorial to the anaerobes that had died to make room for this new world. The geological record preserved our grief in layers of banded iron, in chemical signatures that told the story of our atmospheric transformation, in fossil stromatolites that stood like tombstones over our ancient seas. Future generations would read these rocks like a book of sorrow, understanding that the foundation of their oxygen-rich world was built on the bones of organisms that had never learned to breathe. Yet the memory was not just geological, it lived on in the cells themselves. The mitochondria that powered eukaryotic life carried within their own DNA the genetic memory of the bacterial cells they had once been. They were living fossils, preserving in their molecular machinery the biochemical innovations that had allowed life to survive our great chemical revolution. Every time a cell respired, it enacted an ancient drama of adaptation and survival. The anaerobic organisms that had survived in our deep refuges became the keepers of our pre-extinction heritage. They persisted in environments where oxygen could not penetrate, in deep sediments, in thermal vents, in the guts of the complex organisms that had inherited our oxygenated world. They were living museums, preserving metabolic pathways and biochemical strategies that represented billions of years of evolution in our breathless past. These survivors played crucial roles in the new ecosystems that emerged from our chemical transformation. They recycled nutrients in environments where aerobic processes could not function. They produced compounds that other organisms needed. They maintained chemical cycles that connected our oxygenated surface world with the ancient chemistry of our depths. Our biosphere had become layered, with different chemical regimes supporting different forms of life in a complex, vertical ecology. The extinction had taught us that evolution was not a progressive march toward greater complexity, but a cyclical dance of creation and destruction. Innovation often came at the cost of existing adaptation. New opportunities emerged from the collapse of old systems. Death and birth were partners in the ongoing experiment of life, each enabling the other in ways that single generations could never fully understand. We began to recognize patterns that would repeat throughout our biological history. Successful innovations often became environmental crises as their waste products accumulated and changed the conditions that had allowed them to flourish. Life repeatedly transformed its own habitat, creating new challenges that required new adaptations. Our biosphere was not a stable system, but a dynamic one, constantly rebuilding itself through cycles of disruption and renewal. The oxygen that now seemed essential to complex life had once been equally essential to simpler life, but as a poison that tested every organism's ability to adapt or die. The same chemical that enabled aerobic respiration had driven the extinction of organisms that defined respiration differently. We had learned that essentiality was contextual, that what was necessary for one form of life could be lethal to another. The memory of our mass extinction lived on in the genetic code itself. The molecular mechanisms that protected cells from oxidative damage, antioxidant systems, DNA, repair pathways, stress response proteins, were evolutionary innovations forged in the crisis of rising oxygen levels. Every complex organism carried within its cells the biochemical solutions that their ancestors had developed to survive our chemical transformation. Climate patterns bore the signature of our ancient catastrophe. The ice ages that had followed our oxygenation event had established new patterns of ocean circulation, atmospheric dynamics, and continental weathering that would influence our climate for billions of years. Our current atmospheric composition was not a return to pre-extinction conditions, but something entirely new, a chemical environment that had never existed before in our history. The diversity that had been lost could never be fully recovered. The metabolic innovations that had been eliminated during our mass extinction represented evolutionary experiments that would never be repeated. Our biological history carried gaps where entire lineages had vanished, taking with them biochemical strategies that might have led to forms of life we could never imagine. Yet the extinction had also created opportunities that would never have existed otherwise. The niches vacated by anaerobic organisms became available for aerobic colonization. The energy density of oxygen metabolism enabled cellular complexity that had been impossible in our low-energy past. The chemical reactivity that had been destructive to ancient life became constructive for modern life. We learned to see our mass extinction not as a failure but as a transformation, painful, costly, but ultimately creative. The death of our anaerobic biosphere had been the birth of our aerobic one. The poison that had killed our first children had become the medicine that enabled our future children to achieve forms of complexity and beauty that transcended anything our ancient seas had known. Every ecosystem that flourished in our oxygenated world was a child of that ancient catastrophe, a descendant of the survivors who had learned to breathe poison and transform it into power. The forests that would eventually cover our continents, the animals that would develop consciousness and language, the technological civilizations that would arise from biological complexity, all were possible only because life had survived its own innovation and learned to find opportunity in the wreckage of its own success. The memory of death lived on not as trauma, but as wisdom, the understanding that innovation and extinction were partners in the dance of evolution, that survival required not just adaptation to existing conditions, but the ability to thrive in the worlds that innovation created. We breathed with the ghosts of our ancient atmosphere, exhaled with the knowledge that every breath was both ending and beginning, memorial and celebration of the long journey from poison to power. The world still breathes through us. In the quiet moments before dawn, when human cities sleep, and only the most essential processes of civilization continue their work, you can feel it, the ancient rhythm that connects your breathing to the breath of the world itself. Each inhalation draws in oxygen molecules that may have been exhaled by a cyanobacterial colony 3 billion years ago. Each exhalation releases carbon dioxide that will be captured by plants and transformed back into the organic compounds that sustain life. You are breathing with the entire history of our atmosphere. The oxygen that fills your lungs carries within its molecular structure the memory of our great extinction, the story of how poison became power, how death enabled life to achieve forms of complexity that our ancient anaerobic ancestors could never have imagined. Your every breath is a continuation of the experiment that began when life first learned to split water and release the gas that would reshape our entire world. Your cells carry within them the living heritage of our chemical revolution. The mitochondria that power your metabolism are the direct descendants of the bacterial cells that first mastered aerobic respiration billions of years ago. They retain their own DNA, their own evolutionary history, their own molecular memory of the time when breathing oxygen was an innovation so radical it required cooperation between different forms of life to make it possible. When you exhale carbon dioxide, you participate in the same carbon cycle that has regulated our climate for billions of years. The molecules you release will be captured by photosynthetic organisms, plants, algae, and the remaining cyanobacteria that are the evolutionary descendants of those that triggered our great oxygenation. They will use the energy of our sun to convert your exhaled carbon back into organic compounds, completing a cycle of chemical transformation that connects you to every other living thing on our surface. Your oxygen metabolism generates the same waste heat that warms every aerobic organism. This thermal energy connects you to the global energy budget that drives our weather systems, our ocean currents, and the complex feedback loops that maintain our climate within ranges that can support complex life. Your breathing is part of our planetary breathing, your body temperature a component of our global temperature. The atmospheric composition that you depend on is not natural in any simple sense. It is the product of billions of years of biological innovation and environmental transformation. The 21% oxygen in our air represents a carefully maintained balance between oxygen production by photosynthetic organisms and oxygen consumption by aerobic metabolism. You breathe in an artificial atmosphere, one created and maintained by the collective activity of all life on our surface. The extinction that preceded your existence eliminated forms of life that might have led to entirely different evolutionary outcomes. The anaerobic world that was destroyed by oxygenation might have developed its own forms of complexity, its own solutions to the challenges of existence. Your oxygen-dependent existence is not inevitable or predetermined. It is one possible outcome among many that might have emerged from our ancient experiments in chemistry and cooperation. Yet the anaerobic heritage lives on in you as well. Your gut microbiome contains billions of organisms that practice ancient forms of metabolism, processing nutrients through chemical pathways that were developed in our breathless seas billions of years ago. These microbes are your partners in digestion, your collaborators in maintaining the chemical balance that keeps your complex body functioning. They remind you that aerobic and anaerobic life are not opposites, but partners in the ongoing enterprise of biological existence. The intelligence that allows you to understand this story, to trace the connection between your breathing and our planetary history, is itself a product of the energy surplus that aerobic metabolism made possible. The human brain consumes oxygen at rates that would have been impossible to sustain with anaerobic metabolism alone. Your consciousness, your ability to wonder about your place in our history, your capacity to feel awe at the story of our transformation, all of these depend on the evolutionary innovations that emerged from our ancient catastrophe. When you look at the night sky and see other worlds orbiting distant stars, you are seeing planets that may be facing their own oxygenation events, their own biological revolutions, that will determine what forms of life are possible in their future. The oxygen signature that astronomers search for in exoplanet atmospheres is a sign that life has achieved the same transformation on those worlds that life achieved here. The conversion of poison into power, the mastery of chemistry that enables complexity. Your own breathing continues. The conversation that began when life first exhaled into our ancient atmosphere. Every breath you take changes our atmospheric composition in minute but measurable ways. Every exhalation contributes to the chemical cycles that will determine what forms of life are possible in our future. You are not just a product of our evolutionary history, you are a participant in our ongoing evolution. The dream that began with the first cyanobacterial cell that learned to split water continues in your respiratory cycle. The vision of biological complexity that survived our mass extinction lives on in your nervous system. The experiment in cooperation that created eukaryotic cells expresses itself in your symbiotic relationship with the trillions of microbes that call your body home. As you sleep tonight, as your breathing slows to the rhythm of dreams, you rejoin the ancient pulse that has driven our planet's biological innovation for billions of years. Your quiet respiration becomes part of our planetary respiration, your individual existence connected to the collective breathing of forests and phytoplankton, soil bacteria and deep-sea creatures, all of us sharing the oxygen that was once poison, all of us exhaling into the future that is still being written. The world breathes through you, and you breathe with the world. And in that exchange of gases and energy and ancient memory, the dream of life continues to unfold in ways that even we cannot yet imagine. The story that began with our first breath is still being told with every breath you take, still discovering what it means to transform death into life, poison into power, catastrophe into beauty. In the end, you are our continuation, the living expression of our longest dream, breathing our ancient atmosphere into forms of consciousness that can finally understand the story of how breathing itself was born.